Picture this. The year is 1867. The place, a dusty mining camp somewhere along the rolling plains of Montana Territory. The sun has slipped low, casting a burnt orange glow across a scattering of tents, shacks, and one sagging wooden saloon with its doors creaking in the evening breeze. Men spill into the street, loud with whiskey and arguments about gold claims. A mule brays in protest as a card table crashes through a window. Somewhere down the road, 2 shots ring out, and yet no sheriff appears. There is no jail. There is no courthouse. The town is on its own. This was the reality for much of 19th century America's frontier. As settlers pushed westward, towns popped up almost overnight, drawn by the promise of silver, cattle, or timber. But institutions took time. Judges, marshals, and proper courtrooms often arrived years too late. In the meantime, people had to improvise. Justice was not a distant figure in a robe. It was your neighbor, your fellow prospector, or perhaps the man holding a rope and looking impatient. To outsiders, it seemed shocking, even barbaric. But to the men and women who lived there, it was survival. A community couldn't wait months for a circuit judge to ride through when theft, violence, and fraud happened daily. In a land without law, justice became immediate, creative, and unmistakably public. And so, the Vigilantes were born. The word vigilante itself comes from the Latin vigilare, to keep watch. And in towns with no law, keeping watch was everyone's job. If your horse was stolen, you didn't file a report. You grabbed your neighbors, saddled up, and rode after the thief. If a drunkard threatened the peace of the saloon, men hauled him outside and taught him a lesson with fists, belts, or, in some cases, a sturdy rail to ride. These weren't random acts of cruelty. They were community solutions, messy but effective. What's most striking is the silence of authority in these places. Diaries and newspapers from the era described communities where the only law was posted on a scrap of paper nailed to a saloon wall. Rules like no stealing, no fighting, no swearing at womenfolk, offenders will be punished. It sounds almost comical, yet it carried weight. The community's strength rested not in distant statutes, but in the shared agreement that misbehavior would be dealt with swiftly, often within hours. And dealt with it was. Frontier justice prized speed and spectacle. If a thief was caught, he wasn't locked away. He was marched to the main street where everyone could see. The punishment might be a quick whipping, a forced apology, or being run out of town entirely. The important part was that it happened before witnesses, so the story spread like wildfire. A punishment unseen was hardly a punishment at all.
Not every act was grim. There was often an odd sense of theatre, even humour, to these proceedings. A drunk who disturbed Sunday service might wake the next morning with his boots nailed to the church roof. A gambler accused of cheating might be paraded around town wearing a sign that read "card sharp." These punishments were part lesson, part entertainment, blending shame with laughter, ensuring no one forgot the offender's name. But of course, beneath the laughter was fear. Everyone knew the same rough justice could fall on them if they crossed the wrong line. Communities were tight-knit, and reputation was everything. To be branded a thief, a liar, or a cheat was to risk your livelihood, your friendships, and sometimes your very place in town. Frontier towns had no patience for repeated troublemakers. More than one settler found himself bundled onto a wagon and told to keep moving west, exiled not by decree, but by the collective will of his neighbours. In many ways, these early settlements operated like large families. Discipline was personal, direct, and often physical. A father didn't need a court to punish his son, he handled it himself. And in the same spirit, a community didn't wait for a distant marshal to correct a wrongdoer, they did it together. Order was fragile, but it was enforced. Looking back, it's easy to wonder how people endured such uncertainty, never knowing if the justice of the day would be fair or merely the anger of the crowd. Yet, for those who lived it, this was normal. They accepted that the cost of freedom, land, and fortune was the risk of living in a place where law came not from books, but from the people standing beside you in the dusty street. And so, as night settled over that little Montana camp in 1867, men laughed too loudly in the saloon, women bolted their doors, and a few self-appointed guardians kept their rifles close at hand. For in a town without law, it was not the badge that guaranteed safety, it was the watchful eyes of your neighbours, that whispered warnings and, if all else failed, the certainty that wrongdoers would face justice, swiftly, publicly, and without hesitation.
When settlers pushed westward in the mid-19th century, they carried with them wagons, tools, and dreams, but often left behind the steady institutions of law. Out on the frontier, the nearest courthouse might be hundreds of miles away, the nearest sheriff too busy or too few in number to cover the vast stretches of open land. In that vacuum, daily life was both exhilarating and terrifying. A man's word might mean everything one day and nothing the next. Towns sprang up around mines, railroads, and cattle trails almost overnight. Canvas tents or wooden shacks formed hasty main streets where saloons opened before schools and gambling tables appeared long before churches. In such places, disputes were inevitable. A stolen horse, a drunken fight, a quarrel over a gold claim. Each could spark violence. Yet there was often no official court to hear grievances, no judge to weigh evidence, no jail to hold the accused. And so justice fell into the hands of ordinary citizens. Groups of men, sometimes ranchers, sometimes merchants, sometimes just restless miners, banded together, calling themselves committees or associations. Their purpose was clear: to protect the community by whatever means necessary. Whether that meant chasing down cattle thieves or punishing suspected murderers, they acted swiftly, without the slow procedures of the law. The very absence of authority shaped their mentality. Where people could not rely on a marshal, they became marshals themselves. Where there was no legal code, custom and consensus filled the gap. The frontier valued speed, efficiency, and above all, the message that wrongdoing would not be tolerated. But this improvisation came at a cost. Evidence was often shaky, witnesses unreliable, and tempers hot. Still, the people of these towns believed that some action, any action, was better than none. They had come west not only for opportunity, but also for safety, and a community that failed to protect itself would quickly dissolve. In their minds, to let crime go unanswered was more dangerous than a hurried, rough form of justice. It was in this climate that vigilante groups gained both their power and their popularity. They were seen not as renegades, but as saviors, ordinary citizens rising to do the work the absent law could not. For many, these committees gave structure to an otherwise chaotic world, and though their methods could be brutal, they carried a kind of legitimacy born of necessity. Still, beneath the surface, questions lingered. Who decided what counted as guilt? Who stood to benefit when a rival miner was accused of theft? And what protection did the innocent truly have when suspicion alone could be enough to bring punishment? The lawless frontier, in short, was fertile ground for both justice and injustice. The line between them was often as thin as a rope stretched across a gallows beam.
By the mid-1800s, the word committee meant something very different on the frontier than it did in the polished halls of eastern cities. Out west, the Committee of Vigilance was not a group of gentlemen sipping tea and drafting resolutions. It was a gathering of neighbors, merchants, miners, ranchers, ordinary men who had decided that if the law would not come to them, they would become the law themselves. The process often began in whispers. A theft, a shooting, or a string of suspicious fires would stir the town. At first, people would grumble in saloons or at the general store. Where's the sheriff? Why hasn't anyone been arrested? But when days passed with no official action, conversations hardened into resolve. Something had to be done. The men would gather, sometimes in the back of a saloon, sometimes under the cover of darkness in a barn, and choose a leader. They drafted makeshift bylaws, elected captains, and swore oaths of secrecy. Loyalty to the committee came above all else, for betrayal meant danger not only to the group, but to the fragile sense of order they were trying to build. Many committees adopted rituals that lent them an air of authority. Minutes were taken, rules were recited, and members pledged to defend one another. Some even carried badges or ribbons to identify themselves when acting in public. For a population starved of structure, these trappings gave the vigilantes legitimacy. They were not, at least in their own eyes, a mob. They were a civic body, a stand-in for the absent government. Once established, a committee's influence spread quickly. Suspects were summoned, evidence, however thin, was presented, and decisions were made with startling speed. A man accused of horse theft might find himself on trial before 24 neighbors within hours of being caught. The verdict could be a whipping, banishment, or in the most serious cases, hanging. The frontier valued decisiveness. In a land where the nearest judge might be weeks away, delay was seen as weakness. Committees prided themselves on acting swiftly. "Let justice be done tonight," one Montana miner reportedly said, "so we can all get back to work in the morning."
and indeed business and order often resumed as if nothing had happened, the act of punishment itself sealing the wound before it could fester. But swiftness came with dangers. Accusations might stem from grudges, rivalries, or prejudice. A wealthy merchant could sway a committee against a competitor. An unpopular stranger might be convicted more on suspicion than on proof. For all their rituals of fairness, vigilante committees operated outside the boundaries of due process. Still, to many, they symbolized hope. Towns that had once seemed vulnerable suddenly felt protected. Families slept more soundly knowing that someone, however unofficial, was watching. Merchants believed their goods were safer, miners trusted their claims would be respected, and saloons bustled with new confidence that order, however rough, existed. And so vigilante committees became woven into the fabric of frontier life. They were not temporary stopgaps, but, in many places, enduring institutions. Some operated in secret for years, surfacing only when crisis struck. Others became so powerful they rivaled the very governments that eventually tried to replace them. The story of these committees is one of human ingenuity in the face of chaos, but also a cautionary tale. When the people themselves hold the power to accuse, judge, and punish, what protects the innocent? What separates justice from vengeance?
If the frontier had no courthouses, it made its own. In barns, saloons, dusty town squares, or even beneath the shade of cottonwoods, trials unfolded with the drama of theatre. They were not polished proceedings with wigs and robes. They were spectacles, part judgment, part entertainment, and part moral lesson for anyone watching. A suspect might be dragged before a circle of townsfolk at sundown, the glow of lanterns flickering against grim faces. A hastily chosen jury of miners or farmers sat with crossed arms while the leader of the Vigilance Committee presided like a stern magistrate. Evidence, if it existed, was laid out with dramatic flair. A stolen saddle, a bloodied knife, a witness trembling as they recounted the crime. The accused rarely had an advocate. He was left to plead his own case, often against the rising tide of community anger. But the trial was about more than facts. It was ritual. Each stage had to be observed, for it was the ritual that transformed punishment from vengeance into justice. Without the performance, it would be little more than a lynching. With it, the community could claim legitimacy, even fairness. Spectators gathered eagerly. Mothers with children, storekeepers, drifters, and cowhands all pressed in to see the drama unfold. For many, it was their only taste of civic life, a shared moment when the community defined its values out loud. The hush as accusations were read, the murmurs as evidence was revealed, the cries of approval or outrage. It was theatre of the most immediate kind, with human life at stake. Sometimes the accused was acquitted and the crowd dispersed, with relief as if fairness had triumphed. But often the verdict was guilty and the punishment swift. A thief might be tied to a post and lashed before the crowd, each blow punctuated by jeers or solemn silence. A drunkard might be banished, escorted to the edge of town and told never to return. And in the gravest cases, murder, betrayal, or horse stealing, the sentence was death. Even the executions bore ritual. A man condemned to hang might be given a few words to speak, an appeal for forgiveness, a denial of guilt, or a bitter curse. Then, with the crowd gathered, the deed was done. Some wept, others cheered, but all carried the memory. For days afterwards, the town buzzed with retellings, each person shaping the narrative, embedding it into local legend. Theatrical justice had its costs. Haste often meant mistakes. Innocent men could be condemned on rumour, while guilty men with friends in the right places might escape. Personal feuds sometimes masqueraded as justice, with committees settling scores under the guise of protecting the town. And because there was no higher court to appeal to, a vigilante verdict was final, etched into the soil of the frontier without recourse. Yet, paradoxically, this raw performance also helped knit communities together. By gathering to witness justice, however flawed, settlers affirmed a shared moral code. They saw that rules existed even in the wilderness. The rituals, the speeches, the solemn declarations gave shape to law where none had been before. In this sense, vigilante trials were less about the accused and more about the audience. They were morality plays, designed to remind everyone what lines could not be crossed. The frontier was a place where survival depended on trust. Trust that your neighbor would not steal your horse, that your partner would honor his claim, that your town would not descend into chaos. Vigilante trials, for all their dangers, offered reassurance. They promised that even here, at the ragged edge of civilization, there was order, however rough. But just beneath that order simmered another reality, the thrill of power. For many vigilantes, sitting in judgment was intoxicating.
It gave ordinary men the chance to play magistrate, sheriff, and executioner all at once. And once a community tasted that power, it was not easily relinquished.
At first, vigilance committees were born from necessity. A town with no sheriff needed protection, a mining camp with no courts needed order. But necessity has a way of turning into habit, and habit, left unchecked, can become tyranny. By the mid-19th century, many communities discovered that their saviors were just as capable of becoming their oppressors. The problem was power. Once a committee tasted it, once ordinary men had the authority to judge, punish, and even kill, it was not easy to let go. In Montana Territory during the 1860s, the famous Vigilance Committee of Alder Gulch began by targeting suspected road agents and thieves. They hanged more than 20 men in a matter of weeks. At first, locals cheered, crime plummeted, and travelers felt safer. But soon rumors swirled. Were all the men guilty? Or were some executed because they were rivals in mining claims, or simply outsiders who didn't fit in? Whispers turned into unease, unease into fear. Who watched the vigilantes? Who held them accountable? The same men who claimed to defend the town were now a law unto themselves, operating in the shadows, delivering justice behind closed doors. Some committees even refused to disband once sheriffs and courts were finally established. Why step aside, after all, when you held the power to decide who lived and who died? This drift toward tyranny was not confined to Montana. In San Francisco, the Vigilance Committees of 1851 and 1856 became infamous for their sheer scale. Thousands of men enrolled, patrolling the streets with muskets, setting up their own headquarters, and even constructing makeshift prisons. They hanged men accused of arson, exile, or murder, but they also targeted political opponents. Corruption in City Hall was their justification, but in practice the committees blurred justice with politics, silencing rivals as often as they punished criminals. The atmosphere could be chilling. Citizens woke each day, unsure whether the knock at the door came from a neighbor or from masked vigilantes with a rope in hand. Newspapers sometimes praised the committees, but others warned that Republican government cannot coexist with secret tribunals. What had begun as neighborhood protection now looked like mob rule dressed in ritual. The irony was painful. Communities had turned to vigilantes to escape lawlessness, yet in many places they had simply traded one form of chaos for another. Instead of fear of outlaws, they now lived with fear of their own neighbors who might decide that your words, your actions, or your mere presence marked you as unfit for the community. For all their rhetoric about fairness, vigilantes often struck hardest at the vulnerable. Immigrants, itinerant workers, and anyone without powerful friends were easy targets. A drifter accused of theft might be whipped or banished with little evidence, while a rich rancher could bribe his way out of trouble. The committees reflected not only the values of the frontier, but also its prejudices, drawing sharp lines about who belonged and who didn't. And yet, the people tolerated them. For a time. Fear as a way of silencing dissent. Many reasoned that, tyrannical as they were, vigilantes still kept a lid on crime. Others kept their doubts to themselves, not wishing to attract suspicion. After all, to criticize the committee was to risk being accused yourself. But over time, resistance grew. Ministers preached against the violence from pulpits. Reformers wrote fiery editorials warning that unchecked vigilantism undermined the very principles of American liberty. And when formal institutions, sheriffs, judges, legislatures, finally gained strength in frontier towns, they often clashed with vigilantes for control. Some committees faded quietly, others were disbanded under pressure, and a few fought bitterly before yielding. Still, the memory of their power lingered. Vigilante tyranny left scars, stories of men hanged without fair trial, of families ruined by suspicion, of communities divided long after the ropes were cut down. For every town that remembered vigilantes as heroes, another remembered them as oppressors. In this tension lies the dark paradox of vigilante justice. The same hands that built order could also unravel it. The same men who promised safety could spread fear. And the line between hero and tyrant on the American frontier was sometimes as thin as the rope hanging from a cottonwood branch.
For all their dangers, vigilantes didn't vanish overnight. In fact, in many frontier towns, they stuck around long after sheriffs were elected and courthouses were built. To modernize that seems strange. Why cling to mobs when official law was finally available? The answer lies in three enduring forces: trust, fear, and myth. Let's start with trust, or rather, the lack of it. In the 19th century frontier, law wasn't always trustworthy. Sheriffs could be corrupt, judges could be bought, and politicians often served the powerful before the people. A vigilance committee, on the other hand, was made up of neighbours. Many knew from church, from the mine, from the fields. They weren't strangers in a distant capital, they were part of your daily life. To many, that familiarity was more reassuring than a courtroom with unfamiliar rules and men in stiff coats. Justice felt closer, more immediate, and more personal. Then came fear. The frontier was a nervous place. Outlaws roamed freely, towns could be wiped out overnight by violence, and the constant churn of strangers moving westward made communities wary. In such an environment, people often believed that swift, dramatic punishment was the only way to keep order. A thief quietly fined by a judge might slip away unnoticed, but a thief hanged in the town square sent a message no one could miss. Vigilante justice was theatre, and fear was its audience. This theatre fed directly into myth. Vigilantes weren't just men with ropes and guns, they became symbols of courage and righteousness in popular imagination. Newspapers played a part, often praising vigilance committees as brave defenders of morality. Dime novels, later in the century, romanticized them even more. The image of the lone vigilante or the noble committee fed into the larger myth of the Wild West, a place where law was weak, but ordinary men rose up to defend what was right. And myths are powerful. They give communities identity, a story to tell about themselves. A town scarred by violence could retell its history as a story of heroism. Yes, times were hard, but we banded together, we took action, we defended our own. This retelling helped people cope with the darker parts, the hangings, the wrongful punishments, the fear. In myth, vigilantes became not oppressors, but saviors. Yet, endurance wasn't only about stories. It was about practical survival. Consider the geography of the frontier. Endless miles of wilderness, few soldiers, fewer courts. A community hundreds of miles from the nearest judge couldn't afford to wait weeks for justice. Vigilantes endured because they filled a gap no one else could fill. They were a stopgap solution that sometimes hardened into permanent practice. There's another wrinkle here too. Vigilantes offered a form of justice that was collective. A courtroom divides, judge, jury, lawyers, accused. Vigilante rituals united. When the community gathered to watch a punishment, they participated in a shared moment, a collective assertion of values. Right or wrong, it created solidarity. To oppose the vigilantes was to risk exclusion, suspicion, even accusations of sympathy for criminals. To support them, even silently, was to affirm your place within the community. And so, for decades, the committees held on. Even as reformers protested, even as newspapers raised alarms, even as states expanded their reach, vigilantes endured in pockets of the country. They lasted because people wanted them to last. Not everyone, not always, but enough. Enough to keep the rope coiled, the masks ready, the meetings whispered in barns and back rooms. Of course, endurance came at a cost. Communities that leaned on vigilantes often found it harder to build lasting institutions. When men grew accustomed to taking justice into their own hands, they resisted ceding that power to sheriffs and courts. This tension slowed the growth of formal law in many parts of the frontier. The very thing that protected the community in the short term made it harder to transition into stable government in the long term. Looking back, it's easy to shake our heads. But on the edge of the frontier, when tomorrow was uncertain and safety was fragile, people wanted results, fast. And vigilantes gave them that. Immediate, visible, unforgettable results. Results you could hear in the hush of the crowd as the verdict was read, in the creak of rope against wood, in the uneasy silence afterward when the community shuffled home, both reassured and unsettled. That is why vigilantes endured. Not because they were perfect, not even because they were just, but because they gave people something they desperately craved. The feeling, however temporary, that order was possible in a world that felt like chaos.
Not every vigilante action was noble or even necessary. If the frontier had shown anything, it was that when power gathers without restraint, it often slips into abuse. By the mid to late 19th century, some vigilante groups were no longer satisfied with chasing down horse thieves or punishing murderers. Instead, they began to extend their reach into politics, personal feuds, and even social control. One of the clearest examples comes from Montana Territory in the 1860s. The famous Montana Vigilantes, who started by hunting down the Innocence gang of road agents, grew so influential that their authority rivaled any official government presence. At first, townsfolk welcomed this. After all, they had stopped the murders along the stagecoach routes. But as time went on, the lines blurred. Men accused of minor thefts or drunken disorder sometimes faced the same rope as hardened killers. Whispers spread that the vigilantes had begun to use their nooses for more than justice. They were wielding them as tools of power. In some towns, simply being unpopular could put you in danger. Merchants who refused to bend to the will of a vigilante-dominated council might find themselves accused of dishonesty. Rival ranchers might suddenly be labelled cattle thieves. And once the mob gathered, facts became harder to separate from rumour. The same force that had once protected the frontier began to resemble the very tyranny it claimed to fight. The problem was simple but dangerous. Vigilantes answered only to themselves. There were no appeals, no juries, no oversight. A verdict could be reached in a smoky saloon within an hour, and the sentence carried out before dawn. Justice was swift, but it was also final. And if it was wrong, there was no turning back. These excesses weren't unique to Montana. In California, vigilante committees became so powerful they effectively replaced elected officials, staging their own trials and then hanging or deporting those they deemed guilty. While some historians argue these committees did bring order to lawless cities like San Francisco, others see them as proto-political machines, forces that could silence dissent, intimidate rivals, and reshape society by fear. At times, the violence spiraled into open terror. Ethnic minorities often bore the brunt of vigilante wrath. In towns across Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona, Mexican and indigenous men accused of theft or assault were far more likely to be lynched than white settlers, regardless of evidence. Chinese immigrants, too, found themselves frequent targets in Western cities, branded as outsiders and punished without proof. What began as frontier justice sometimes slipped into outright racial persecution. Even within communities, vigilante actions could fracture rather than unite. Families of executed men often carried bitterness for generations, and feuds sparked by mob justice sometimes erupted into years of quiet hostility. The frontier thrived on a fragile balance of cooperation, and when vigilantes upset that balance, towns could unravel into suspicion and fear. By the 1880s, the darker side of vigilantism was well known. Newspapers carried stories of mobs that hanged innocent men, of power-hungry leaders who used law and order committees to push out rivals, and of communities haunted by their own hasty judgments. As railroads spread, courts formed, and sheriffs finally held more authority, people began to question whether vigilante justice was truly a solution, or just another problem dressed in frontier clothing. And yet, the paradox remained. While many saw vigilantes as brutal, others still believed they had been necessary in their time. Without them, some argued, crime would have swallowed the frontier whole before the law ever caught up. The tragedy was not that vigilantes existed, it was that they could not always stop themselves from becoming the very criminals they swore to fight. This tension between justice and excess, protection and abuse, was at the heart of vigilante history. It was what made their story so human, so messy, and so unforgettable.
By the late 19th century, the frontier had begun to change. Railroads carved steel paths across vast plains. Telegraph wires hummed with news and orders from hundreds of miles away. Settlements that had once been little more than clusters of tents grew into towns with courthouses, jails, and elected officials. Slowly but surely, the world of vigilantes gave way to something more familiar: the rule of law. It wasn't an overnight transformation. In many places, vigilantes still operated alongside sheriffs and judges. A trial might be scheduled for a month later, but a group of masked men could render their own judgment the very next night. Still, the presence of permanent institutions chipped away at the old ways. When a town finally built a sturdy jail with iron bars, the need to hang a thief on the spot began to fade. The U.S. government also expanded its reach. Federal marshals roamed territories once considered ungovernable, and circuit judges rode from town to town, holding court wherever they could find a room large enough. Though often overworked and underpaid, these officials brought a sense of legitimacy that vigilante justice lacked.
A guilty verdict in court carried more weight than a rope thrown over a tree branch, if only because it came with witnesses, records, and some semblance of fairness. As order spread, so too did skepticism about vigilantes. Newspapers became powerful voices in shaping public opinion, and their editors increasingly condemned mob actions as barbaric relics of an earlier time. Town leaders, eager to attract settlers and investors, realized that stories of lynchings did little to convince families to move west. Respectability required law, not mobs. Economics also played a role. When cattle barons and railroad tycoons poured money into frontier towns, they wanted stability, not vigilante uncertainty. Contracts, trade, and land claims required legal recognition, something a band of masked riders could never provide. In this sense, business interests helped push vigilantes out as much as sheriffs did. Still, the transition was uneven. In some areas, law came swiftly, and vigilantes retired their ropes. In others, old habits lingered. A community might still drag a man from his cell if they doubted a judge's ruling. Even as late as the 1890s, lynchings continued across the American West, reminders that mob justice never vanished entirely. Yet for all its persistence, vigilantism no longer defined the frontier as it once had. By the dawn of the 20th century, the Wild West had given way to something else. States with functioning governments, towns with mayors and councils, and a nation intent on showing it had outgrown its lawless youth. The rough edges of vigilante rule were smoothed over, sometimes remembered with pride, sometimes with shame, but always as part of the story of how the West was tamed. In the end, the decline of vigilantes wasn't about one single event, but about the gradual tightening of civilization's grip. The telegraph, the courthouse, the sheriff's badge, and the steady march of settlers all conspired to make mob justice less necessary, less tolerated, and eventually less imaginable. And yet, the shadow of vigilantes never disappeared entirely. Their memory lingered in folklore, dime novels, and campfire tales. The frontier had given birth to a uniquely American paradox. People who broke the law in order to enforce it, who punished crime but sometimes committed crimes themselves. By the time the law truly arrived, vigilantes had already etched themselves into the mythology of the West, a reminder of both the fragility of order and the lengths people will go to create it when none exists.
When we look back at the world of vigilantes, it's tempting to treat them as legends, masked riders galloping beneath the moon, dispensing justice where court dared not tread. But their reality was far less romantic. Vigilantes were farmers, miners, merchants, and neighbors who decided that order mattered more than law, that justice delivered swiftly was better than none at all. They filled a gap that government had left empty, and for that reason, they remain a paradox in American history, both protectors and transgressors, both guardians of community and violators of individual rights. They stood as proof that people will always create order, even if it means bending morality to do it. The legacy of vigilantes lingers today, not in ropes or mobs, but in the way Americans still tell stories about fairness, punishment, and justice. Western movies turned vigilantes into folk heroes, shaping the idea of rugged individuals standing against chaos. Town museums still display old notices nailed to saloon doors, "Horse thieves beware," as relics of a time when law came not from the state, but from the hands of ordinary people. But it's also a cautionary tale. The same impulses that led vigilantes to act, fear, anger, frustration, remain powerful. Left unchecked, those impulses can blur the line between justice and vengeance. And that's why the story of vigilantes still matters. It forces us to ask uncomfortable questions. What happens when law fails? Who has the right to enforce order? And how far would we go if chaos returned? In the 19th century frontier, vigilantes answered those questions with masks and ropes. Today, we might answer differently, but the core tension between order and freedom, law and justice, remains woven into American life. The frontier may be gone, yet its lessons linger in our politics, our culture, and our uneasy fascination with those who ruled before the law arrived. So, the next time you hear the word vigilante, don't picture only Hollywood's dusty gunfighters. Picture instead the worried farmer staring at his stolen horse, the townspeople whispering about a crime gone unpunished, and the quiet decision whispered in the dark, if no one else will act, then we must. That is the true story of why vigilantes ruled the frontier before the law.